Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled Regarding Repatriation, Museums and Native Communities Today, and features Danyelle Means, Executive Director of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's program is a collaboration between the KHC and the Museum and Gallery Studies program in the Art and Design Department at Queensborough Community College, and it builds upon the KHC's longstanding tradition of connecting core themes within both Holocaust and human rights education of erasure and tragedy, of visibility and resilience with how they are expressed and taught within museums and education centers. Today's program is co-sponsored by the Museum Studies MA program at the CUNY School of Professional Studies, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Center for the Study of Human Rights and Genocide at Rutgers University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, and the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University. Finally, after the presentation, please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And now to kick things off, it's my great pleasure to welcome my dear colleague, Kat Griffin, Program Coordinator and Faculty Member in the Gallery and Museum Studies program at Queensborough Community College, and a faculty member within the CUNY School of Professional Studies. Kat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the very warm welcome and introduction. And thank you as well to the Art and Design Department, especially Professor Kathleen Wentrack, our chair of our department. Just very briefly, our program is the only associate's degree in the discipline offered in CUNY, making it a uniquely affordable entry point into the museum field in our region. I'm very happy to highlight that our students benefit from this ongoing partnership with the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, which takes the form of specialized programs such as this, which are built into our curriculum, as well as internships and fellowships, which provide hands-on learning. From surveys of recent graduates, we know that these substantial opportunities are distinct among community colleges and even four-year colleges, and are the reason our students go on to work at museums, including the Museum of Jewish Heritage, the Whitney Museum, Museum of Art and Design, MoMA, the Met, and many other important institutions in New York and beyond. I want to take a moment to thank Dr. Laura Cohen and also today our speaker, Danyelle Means, as she's worked with our students in the past, for the work that they do has created these impactful programs and experiences for our students. With that said, I want to welcome all students and also all the community members who are present. As Dr. Laura Cohen shared, this particular program is part of the ongoing Human Rights in the Museum series, in which, in part, this comes out of a living land acknowledgement resulting from the 2018 through 2020 Native American Survivance Project at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. This took the form of a colloquium, exhibition, and publication. And for this reason, Indigenous voices and viewpoints are centered in many of the Human Rights in Museum series events, including this one. The exhibition at the KHC, Survivance and Sovereignty on Turtle Island, Engaging with Contemporary Native American Art, was co-curated by myself and our speaker, Danyelle Means, who is now the Executive Director of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We are very pleased Danyelle was able to return to join us for this program to speak about an important topic affecting museums and Native communities across Turtle Island. Those revisions to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, that went into effect just in 2024. This program today builds on earlier conversations at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, which are related to repatriation, which have addressed in the past Nazi art theft, repatriation in international context, and repatriation in relationship to Smithsonian institutions. You can find recordings of these programs on the KHC website, and you'll also see a link in the chat as well. Turning back to today's program, for those who are less familiar, since the 1990s, NAGPRA has provided for the protection and return of Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. With NAGPRA, Congress acknowledged that human remains and other cultural items removed from federal or tribal lands belong, in the first case, to lineal descendants, tribes, and Native organizations. Additionally, the law meant to encourage dialogue and also to promote greater understanding between these groups. In 2023, the U.S. Department of the Interior announced significant revisions, specifically requirements the museum inventory collections within a specific time period in the next 5 years. Also notable is a provision that museums must obtain consent from direct descendants before exhibiting human remains, and which has caused a number of museums to cover or remove existing exhibitions. As a longtime museum worker, executive director of Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, and member of Oglala Lakota Nation, Danyelle Means is uniquely knowledgeable about how museums and Native communities are impacted by NAGPRA today. Briefly, Danyelle has previously served as the development director for the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts, Inc., and was the first Indigenous executive director for the Center for Contemporary Arts in Santa Fe. Means has also worked as project manager at Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and she holds board memberships with the Joan Mitchell Foundation and 516 Arts. I'm also very happy to share that she serves as an advisory board member for our own Gallery Museum Studies program here at Queensborough Community College. Danyelle, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you back for this program, and the Zoom is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. I'm going to share my screen with everyone, and just so that we could go through a little bit of repatriation and be able to talk a little bit about what museums have done. Kat outlined a little bit of that in her introduction, but I want to talk a little bit about there we go. I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to see today, and just a little bit about where I am coming from. And I would like to do a little bit of a land acknowledgement as well. I acknowledge the deep connections of the Pueblo, Dene, and Apache peoples to the land, and to the significant contributions of the past, present, and future Indigenous peoples and communities to the life and culture in the greater Southwest. In acknowledging these connections, I'd like to express our gratitude for the opportunity to live, work, and learn on this land. We honor our relationships with Indigenous peoples and commit to working towards reconciling injustices, restoring voices, and realizing community going forward. One of the things that you're looking at right here is a massive sculpture, which is a part of our plaza. And that sculpture is done by a White Mountain Apache artist, Craig Dan Gossan. And the mountain spirit Apache dancer graces our dance circle in our plaza here in Santa Fe, and is a big part of what we do when we welcome our Native delegations. One of the main reasons we welcome our Native delegations is repatriation. And what is repatriation? Repatriation, what is NAGPRA, and why is it important? These are some of the things that we'll be going through over the next 20 minutes or so. What are the definitions and key terms around NAGPRA and this law? What is the process and the controls by which it is implemented? How is it enforced? And most importantly, what is the impact on Native communities? So what is NAGPRA and why is it important? I want to read this because I really want everyone to hear this is exactly what the Department of the Interior, and more specifically the National Park Service, which is responsible for NAGPRA, has on their website. NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a federal law that was passed in 1990 that mandates the return of Native American ancestral remains and cultural items, funerary objects, and sacred items to their respective tribes and lineal descendants from institutions receiving federal funding. This is critical human rights legislation to address the historical mistreatment of Native American cultural heritage by allowing tribes to reclaim their ancestors and sacred belongings with respect and dignity, making it a crucial tool for tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation. So, definitions and key terms. What are we talking about when we're talking about NAGPRA? NAGPRA was passed originally in 1990 with an amendment in 2010, and new regulations just in January, just a year ago. And one of the things that, as Kat alluded to, this has been 30 years in the making, and museums still are reluctant to do this process. And so one of the main reasons these updates came to the law was really because museums had been dragging their feet. That there are a myriad number of reasons why museums would do that. It could be lack of staff. It could be a number of different things. Here at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, we are the archaeological repository for the state of New Mexico. We get archaeology and human remains, I won't say on a monthly basis, but we do have a lot. And somewhere it is estimated, I started here about a year ago, somewhere it is estimated that in our archaeological research collections alone, we have somewhere between 10 and 15 million objects. That is a tremendous amount of repatriation that we have to look forward to. And so this is a really, really important aspect of what we do here at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. Federally recognized tribes, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiian organizations, also all of them can make claims to ancestral remains and cultural objects. The main goal of this law is really to prevent the trafficking of ancestral remains and cultural objects. This has been a key issue for Native tribes. It's an issue here in Santa Fe. We as the museum will have a no questions asked policy for accepting of either archaeological materials or anything that may have been ancestral to New Mexico. That is something we would rather that those materials come back to us here at the museum. We can identify them perhaps and hopefully return them to their homelands. One of the other aspects of what we do is really try and figure out just exactly what we're looking at in terms of NAGPRA. Human remains, ancestral remains, or as we call them, ancestors, those are our highest priority. But not only are we repatriating the remains, we are repatriating everything that was a part of the excavation. So the Lab of Anthropology here in New Mexico is a little more than 100 years old. One of the aspects of the Lab of Anthropology is that it was really the clearinghouse for Southwest archaeology. So a lot of what happened when in last January, when these new updates came through, MIAC started to receive a number of calls from universities around the country saying, oh, by the way, you lent us these ancestral remains and we'd like to give them back now. Those kinds of interactions are hugely important because we do want to make sure that full excavations can be returned, and they can be returned so that they can be reburied in a very, very humane way. We don't want any of the funerary, sacred, or other objects to not go back with the ancestors. So those definitions are very, very important. I also want to point out one thing with the new regulations. Culturally identifiable individual, which was a classification of remains that could not necessarily be identified. The NAGPRA has done away with that definition. All ancestors all human remains should be either identified by geography, identified by where they were returned, identified by where they were potentially purchased. And so one of the things that NAGPRA was very adamant about was that there are no culturally unidentifiable individuals. That is key. Funerary, sacred, and objects of cultural patrimony, those are three different categories that are also part of the repatriation and NAGPRA process. Unassociated funerary objects and associated funerary objects, those definitions have also gone by the wayside. Right now, we look at funerary, sacred, and objects of cultural patrimony. As we get into a little bit of the process, we'll go through what is an inventory versus a summary, and which or both of those have consultation. And it is really, for me, NAGPRA is about relationships, and NAGPRA is really, really important when tribes are trying to identify where they have ancestors still across the country, and also how many of those could possibly be overlapping with other pueblos here in New Mexico or tribes elsewhere in the country. Control versus possession. One of the things I touched on earlier, we are a repository. A repository collection means that anytime the state of New Mexico decides to build a road or expand a road, oftentimes they will come across archaeological finds. Whether those have remains or not, it is now the policy of the state of New Mexico to actually rebury either deeper in the ground where the collections were found, or just adjacent. That allows that as much as possible, the remains or the objects are as undisturbed and remain so. And so they will work with the local tribe to wherever they are digging, and so that will stem the tide of a lot of the archaeology that we do, and that comes to us. But we also work with a number of federal agencies, and examples are the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so on BIA lands, while NAGPRA does not necessarily apply directly to BIA, BIA will handle their own repatriation of objects that we hold for them in our collections. BLM, the Bureau of Land Management is another agency that oftentimes will have collections as part of a larger agency, the state of New Mexico. We also hold collections for the Bureau of Reclamation, as well as the National Park Service. So each of those different agencies, oftentimes we will contract with them to have a contractor that will be working directly with their collections in order to get them repatriated. A big part of what we look at in terms, while we possess those collections, we are not in control of those collections. So each of those federal agencies is in control of those collections and will then repatriate accordingly. What's very important is acquisition history. How much provenience can we find in order to be able to give the most accurate description of what we have? And that is so crucial for the consultation process. We also, like I said, have current and active loans. These objects may have gone out on loan many years ago. And for a semi-permanent type of loan, that is often to a university, and especially a university that has a Southwest archaeology department. So right now we are working with many different universities to update those records and either combine. We just had a repatriation with the University of Minnesota and the Weissman Art Museum. And that was, they held the ancestors as part of their collection. We held the associated, or the funerary objects that were associated with each burial. So putting those all together, that repatriation is going to be taking place sometime in the spring of 2025. So again, we work together to make sure that all of these excavations go back as whole as possible, so that the reburial is just that. It is a complete reburial. The process. So what do we mean by process? And this can have a lot of impact, especially when you start talking about how you invite and talk with the various tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. So consultation is incredibly important. Here in New Mexico, we have a lot of lineal descendants as well. So we work very closely with them. We also evaluate various requests for repatriation or claims for cultural items. And then one of the added, I think, is a bonus for museums, is that one of the onus is on museums to make sure that there is a public notice put out to all tribes to allow them the time and also the consultation process to really decide what or who is going to take responsibility for the actual repatriation and reburial. So there's a lot of different aspects of how you interact with tribes, as well as what you actually work with them on. Oops. So as far as enforcement, this was also a huge part of this year's update to the law. One of the things that is especially important, and we work very closely with the 23 tribes here in the state of New Mexico. In fact, we have an Indian advisory panel, and our IAP works with us to actually to actually figure out where we see potential sales or potential trading of items. And so we will identify those to our IAP members. One of our IAP members happens to be a Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement officer. He was actually involved with one of the more notable repatriations of several Zuni shields a few years ago in Paris. And they had gone up for auction, and actually working with the FBI, the BIA was able to secure 2 of those shields and bring them back to Zuni. And that was an incredible moment for that Pueblo to be able to reunite the various spiritual leaders with those shields. They're incredibly important to the community. But there are criminal provisions for enforcement of NAGPRA. The civil provision, that really falls for the museums. Any museum that does not comply with NAGPRA can be assessed a civil penalty. And a lot of that is withholding of federal funding. We all rely a lot on grants and federal dollars, especially when it comes to NAGPRA. And so without complying, the civil provision really reinforces that museums are responsible for making sure that ancestors, funerary objects, sacred objects, and eventually cultural patrimony is in the hands of the descendants of the people that made them. So, what is the long-term impact on Native communities? One of the things that that was a little disconcerting for me as a museum director was this is an unfunded federal mandate, and that places a tremendous amount of burden on the tribal historic preservation offices. Usually those offices have one person who is manning the phones as well as going out to archaeological sites, or is looking at any of the petroglyphs that are around here in New Mexico. This has put an incredible burden on those offices and those officers in particular. Oftentimes it's just one person. And so one of the things that I think has been incredibly important as a part of this process is really, what can museums bring to this? And so museums have been encouraged by the National Park Service to really look at hopefully covering some of those costs for tribal delegation visits, whether that is a research visit, and that's where you would get a summary, or whether that is a consultation, and that would result in a repatriation. This is incredibly important because sometimes you need to bring not just the tribal historic preservation officer, but you need to bring the spiritual leaders in the community, the elders, also the elected officials. They need to know what we have in our collections and that they may want to repatriate. And so one of the things that the Park Service, as well as the Park Service, offers grants for museums to do just this, as well as cover some costs, whether that is additional staffing, but to be able to host tribes and multiple tribes, because when you're talking about ancestral remains, you're not talking about just one tribe. We've had a lot of, this is one of the oldest areas of the U.S. that has been colonized. And so you have the Spanish influence here. That moved a lot of Pueblo peoples out of different areas. You have Chaco Canyon, you have some of the ancient areas that, again, you had migration, you had movement. And so who are the direct descendants of some of these ancestral items? We need to make sure that we are in conversation with all of the tribes that could possibly be related to these remains. So where things are excavated, where in what proximity to what tribes are they now part of that excavation? Where have they gone off to? So a big part of what the onus is on the museums to really give as much information to their tribal delegations as possible, in order so that basically that they get a sense of who really has a claim to these ancestral remains. One of the things that we've been working with is we have a all Pueblo Council of Governors. So we have 19 Pueblos here in New Mexico, and we also work very closely with the Hopi tribe in Arizona as well. And one of the things that the All Pueblo Council of Governors does is they have created an ad hoc committee that really is very focused on NAGPRA. And that's a huge part of what we need to be able to do, is figure out who would be the repatriating tribe. If all 19 Pueblos have a claim to these ancestors, then how do we work through? The APCG is an incredible partner with us to be able to delegate who is interested in these remains or in reburying these remains. I believe that I've covered just about everything. I think I have a few more minutes. I don't know, Kat or Laura, would you like to open this to the floor to some questions?
Absolutely. Danyelle, thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Thank you so much for your presentation. This was fantastic. And as I said when we're preparing, Danyelle has done a lot of work with folks in the Kupferberg Holocaust Center community and the Queensboro Community College community. And what you offered in terms of your presentation today was just so well tailored for our communities. So I know the communities have lots of questions. So I want to encourage folks to please post questions in the chat, and we will get to hopefully all of those. We have plenty of time to do so. And I'll ask some questions as well, but we have students posting already, I think. So Christopher asked if there are collections found or artifacts found at state, by the state or within the state or by construction companies, are they required to stop what they're doing in that location?
Yes. There would be and we do have an Office of Archaeological Studies. They are part of the overall museum system. So they do contract with both the Department of Transportation and any other organization that or builder that is that would be doing digging. One of the things that this new practice, I'll call it, has done is it really has shortened the amount of time that some of these construction projects have to be stopped, because you can identify just adjacent property to be able to rebury immediately, so that there is really such a limited amount of disturbing of the objects or of the remains.
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that explanation. I think to get We have questions coming in fast and furious. Would you say, Carlene is asking, would you say NAGPRA has had an impact on society since the 1990s? And has it achieved or maintained some of the goals? Like, I think that she means of those, like, have some of those original goals from the 1990 legislation been met?
I hesitate on this because I think there was a sense by museums, and I think it was a wrong sense of that tribes were going to pull the U-Haul up to the back loading dock and just take everything out of the museums, and that has just not been the case. I think one of the really important aspects of the new NAGPRA law is that there is this provision for people to actually go a step further and to make these relationships between tribes and museums a much more constant and mutually beneficial relationship. And I think that that's the more important aspect of what the letter of the law was for, was to really open dialogue between museums and Native communities to be able to say, for example, one of the things that we've been doing for many, many years here at MIAC is hosting tribes to come in and look at all of the material that we have, not just the repatriatable items, but items that may have been purchased by the museum and have descendant artist communities as a part of them. That dialogue allows us to really represent these communities in the best way possible. And that for me is the ultimate goal. And I think was the ultimate goal of the 1990s NAGPRA. Of course, it's very difficult work, repatriation. It requires a strength, not just in terms of being good at your job, but really it requires a whole other level of spirituality and camaraderie and understanding of where and how these things were removed and what we're doing to be a good partner by giving them back and making sure that those burials happen.
I am going to get to all the wonderful questions here, but I think you bring up something that you and I have discussed, and I think is a large conversation within the museum community, is that if there is much need for people who want to do this kind of work, if there's there's students who are present who are interested in doing this kind of work, what advice would you give them in terms of what kind of path? Like, our students are, we have certainly students who are associate's degree students, and then probably some BA and some MA students. Where might you consider they continue to learn if they're interested in doing this, working in repatriation museums?
I think some knowledge of archaeology is always great. Even if it's a survey course or some extra amount of understanding of excavation, of float material on the top of many of these burials, being able to understand just exactly what would be a part of some of these excavations. But also, we're also doing repatriations at places like Carlisle. So these are maybe less than 100 years old. And that, again, any kind of archival work, research, that is really, the provenance is incredibly important. I think one of the other things is, being able to have a community with Native communities. And so I think volunteering as a part of the tribal historic preservation offices. They always need interns. They always need folks to help them do the research and the good work that they're doing. But also in museums, I think one of the things, it's the entry level positions. We're as a matter of fact, I was sharing with Kat and Laura earlier that as a part of this year's state budget, we are asking for an additional $5 million for funding to bring all of the state's museums up to speed on NAGPRA. That is 8 museums and 9 historic sites. So some of these historic sites are old forts. There may be excavations that need to be done in those areas. There are sites of old boarding schools. Again, this is all things that we have to, as professionals, we have to be aware of. And so as a part of this $5 million, a lot of that would be grant funded positions to go around the state and to assess what materials are where and where does the focus have to be for our museums and our historic sites as a part of the NAGPRA process.
Yeah, thank you. One of our students, Queen Hall, is asking, and this is interesting because she brings up, we've been discussing NAGPRA, she brings up the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which was particularly focused on that Smithsonian institution. And she's asking, how can these acts and federal agencies support the repatriation of human remains of other non-Native groups that are not protected by NAGPRA, but whose remains are in those local institutions? It's a very good question.
That's an excellent question. And of course, Smithsonian, that the NMAI Act, that covers all of the Smithsonian museums in terms of their repatriation process. Other federal agencies obviously are not subject to NAGPRA, although they do follow a lot of what NAGPRA does. And that was the examples I gave of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BLM, and the BOR. One of the things that I think is a little different with other communities is that sometimes there is conflicting feelings around the repatriation. Maybe it's a feeling of wanting to do research. That's where I think the NMAI Act and NAGPRA were really a cry from Native groups in particular, because of, going back to our exhibit, Kat, the idea of genocide, and that Native American genocide was a federal policy and was part of a hundreds of years of colonial rule. And so that, to me, was a moment of solidarity for the over 500 tribes that are federally recognized. And that was a moment of solidarity on their part to really push through this legislation. And I think as you start to look at other groups in particular, it is that solidarity and coming together that is going to sort of push those groups forward as we look at any of the whether it was boarding schools, whether it was plantations, whether it was all of that being a part of how we've done it in the Native community and how those communities can take up the same standard.
Thank you. This next question from Umash, I think you've largely answered I think in what you spoke about in terms of folks who want to work in the field, but he's asking specifically what kind of expertise for folks who want to, so I think to assess repatriation requests. So I'm wondering, is there, I think, would a student want to be going needing to have courses in registration? What kinds of expertise might they be looking to acquire in addition to what you spoke about? Is there anything else you want to add there?
I would think, archaeology is the one. It really is things coming from the earth, because that's where we find so much of this. I think that the records keeping, registration is always, again, you think that you have all of the records together, and yet maybe a box has been misplaced. Right now, with somewhere between 10 and 15 million objects, and that's counting every potsherd. So it's a lot of objects, but it is, these are cubic foot boxes that are a part of our collections. We hold right now over 1,200 ancestors. Those are full sets of human remains. And that, in and of itself, I think there's a certain preparation that I think a student would need to do, whether or not you're a spiritual person or not. This is a lot of, this is a very heavy thing to witness, especially when tribal communities come into your space. So there's a lot of trauma around this. There's a lot of triggering when these remains are brought out. There are certain protocols, whether that's a protocol on women not being allowed in some of these areas, and it varies from tribe to tribe. So again, it is doing your homework, and your homework being, where do you want to focus? For example, my tribe is from the Northern Plains. So one thing when I first got here that was very hard for me to understand was, when we identify remains that we know are from our tribe, we bring them home. We go through the process and bring them home. A lot of the Pueblo culture here there are certain protocols, and there are certain taboos around death. The Dene, for example, are death is not something they want to be involved with. So again, how do you do repatriation with Dene remains? Who are they working with? How are they making sure that these remains do get repatriated? And again, that's where it becomes very complicated, and it's not as easy as just understanding, oh, well, these are in our collection now, they shouldn't be. It is that it's that government to government relationship. So understanding Native protocols and understanding the spirituality is another huge aspect that I would say, if anyone is interested in this, it is a big part.
That leads very nicely to some of the other questions. So Christopher's asking if there are any specific local or state level legislations or rulings that you also need to follow, one also needs to follow, or there are other things that, are expected down the line along those lines.
Yeah, well, it's everyone kind of falls back on the NAGPRA regulations. And it, like I said, this All Pueblo Council of Governors, that is an organization we can go to. We're sending our inventories out to everyone, absolutely everyone. We have Apache tribes here in New Mexico. We have Dene or Navajo tribe here in New Mexico, as well as 19 Pueblos. So 23 different tribes are represented here in just within the borders of New Mexico. Now those borders are arbitrary as far as tribes go. We have Southern Plains tribes, Kiowa, Comanche. We also have the Southern Ute. So we are always cognizant of understanding that we should also include some of the other tribes that are outside of our borders, that these borders were arbitrarily drawn, and do not necessarily cover everyone who could make a claim to these materials.
That's exactly what both Catherine and Joe are asking in the chat. This is lovely way the conversation is flowing. Catherine is asking whether you can speak to how NAGPRA has impacted international requests, and thinking about, museums on both sides of borders, such as the U.S. and Canada. And Joe is saying the same. What about those cases? Is there similar legislation with neighboring countries for ancestors who were clearly on both sides, or very likely on both sides of these borders that exist today but did not exist previously, and are not recognized even?
Absolutely. And actually, NMAI has done more on this than I think most of the museums in these borderlands. NMAI, their collection, having worked there a short time, their collection spans the entire Western Hemisphere. So I know that a lot of the international repatriations that they have done, again, it's government to government. It is not, it just like with the sovereign nations, native nations here in the US, it is a government to government interaction. Everyone is given those inventories, and it is something that we're thinking about as a consortium of state museums, is what do we have collections here that claims can be made on the Mexican side of the border? How do we deal with those? We do have a consulate here in Albuquerque, and so we do work with the consulate on many of our programs. So we do have some dances that we've brought up. We've brought up indigenous dancers from Mexico for our community day this past September. And so we do have those relationships. It's a little bit harder because, again, now you're laying on yet another government agency. So it's not just federal, not just state, but now international. So we do have a lot going on with that.
You just spoke to what Zoe asked about as well, which is the idea of international cooperation, and that, but she's, in particular, she mentions the possibility of international cooperation between museums.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you speak to whether some of the repatriation efforts and other activities provide opportunities for that?
I have not personally been involved in any of that, but I do know that that is something that we are open to. We also, not all of the remains that we find are native. We have Spanish remains, and we have many of the Catholic churches or some of the churches that were abandoned. We have cemeteries around there. So again, there's all kinds of different aspects of history that we have to go through. And that's why I stress the research aspect of this, because again, we don't want to do even non-invasive research, that we don't want to do analysis on remains. We do, like I said, we do have an Office of Archaeological Studies, and they do have some analytical equipment that they have used in the past on different remains. But that is something that we really try and steer clear of. And so to really understand exactly where remains have been excavated is incredibly important. So all of the field notes, making sure we have all of that documentation. And it's one of the things that we've been struggling a little bit with, and are deferring to our Native nations, is how do we restrict that, or do all of the field notes also go with the repatriation? So those actual field notes that may be handwritten maps and graphs, those will also go with our repatriations. if they're asked for, because again, that is part of the overall excavation. And so we do have several ancestors who have multiple objects that will be a part of repatriations. One of the more notable collections is the Mimbres collection. And all of those Mimbres bowls, remember, those were part of burials. And so while they're very, very beautiful vessels that sometimes remain intact, all of those vessels are part of very specific burials. They will be repatriated back. And that's, again, we will not photograph them before we go. We will not copy the field notes. All of that material, if it was part of a funerary or an excavation of a burial, will go back as part of repatriation.
I think that this is bringing us close to the end of our program, but you've so beautifully answered all the questions that we've been receiving from students and community members. I think maybe perfect. I see Dr. Laura Cohen coming back on the screen. So Danyelle, thank you so much. It's been a really fantastic speaking conversation with you again. Thank you for sharing so openly and broadly with the students about your work and with your expertise. We really appreciate you. And I'll hand the Zoom back to Dr. Laura Cohen to close out the program with you.
My goodness, Kat and Danyelle, I've been listening rapt to the conversation and also to all the questions. And what I was really struck by is people's interest in this topic. And I'm thinking back when you both curated the Turtle Island exhibition at the center and how much explanation we needed to provide and background, and that the more people came to understand this history, and that this is not a long distance history, this is a history that's happening right now, the more ownership in a way they took over it and sort of pride to be able to then educate other people in their communities about this. And I had one question, because I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm curious in terms of your hope for the next year in our country. I remember we did an event with the artist Judy Dow, and one of the things she mentioned when the pandemic hit is that our community has been here before, and we should listen to our ancestors because we actually have a lot of information. And I wanted to just open this up for you, Danyelle, to kind of, I don't know, I'd love to know what you think.
Yeah, no, we were just talking about this. It's, there's a kind of calm with a lot of these communities, and it's, it reminded me, one of the elders said at our IAP meeting, he basically said, we've all been here before. We've done this before. We take one day at a time. Our mother is here, she's the earth. Our Father is in the sun. We are here as a part of their warmth and comfort. And just always remember that. And that's one thing with NAGPRA as a part of this, to be able to be even just a peripheral part of watching these ancestors go back home or be welcomed back into their communities. There's a feeling of hope. And that's something that I will always cling to. And it is so, I thank you, Laura, for bringing that back up, because there is a sense that we can get through this, that there are opportunities for us to create really long-standing relationships that allow us to just learn even more and more from one another. And so thank you very much for bringing that up. That makes me feel really, really happy inside and hopeful for our future.
You've moved me to tears. It's an honor and a privilege to continue to collaborate with you. And Kat, I wanted to say thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined this conversation today. On behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center, thank you. We hope you all stay safe and be well. Thanks.